Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about medical humanities, food and health shaming, and what pandemics teach us about ourselves and our communities. My guest today is Dr. Kari Nixon. She's an assistant professor of English at Whitworth University. She studies medical humanities and Victorian literature and what they can teach us about living well today. Her research focuses on social understandings of death, disease, and community. Her first academic book, Kept from All Contagion, Germ Theory, Disease, and Dilemma of Human Contact, came out in May 2020, ironically. And her mass market book, Quarantine Life, From Cholera to COVID, What Pandemics Teach Us About Parenting, Work, Life, and Communities from the 1700s to today, comes out in June 2021 and presents 30 lessons from past epidemics and how we can apply them to cope with the strain and stress of the novel coronavirus. Welcome to the show, Dr. Nixon.
Hi, it's so great to be here. I love your podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, this is a long time coming. When I first learned about you, I know you're laughing because, oh my gosh, we've really been talking about doing this for a while. And we've had several conversations on what we wanted to focus the podcast on. But when I first learned about you and your work, I was initially drawn to the food insecurity and food shaming insight you shared in a guest post on SciMoms about a year and a half ago. And we're going to talk about that and what SciMoms is and who they are. But since then, the pandemic hit. And as it turns out, you are somewhat of an expert in pandemics and social science. So, we wanted to add that to the conversation, of course. But I'm just so curious, how does one end up in this field? What led you down this path?
Yeah, it's so interesting because we did meet over my SciMoms article on food, which was written at a time when I was trying to expand what I did in the medical humanities. All of us academics have a very niche specialty. And as you mentioned, mine is infectious disease throughout history. And at the time, a year and a half ago, I was kind of trying to branch into other markets because I was getting a lot of professional feedback that infectious diseases weren't really relevant in the American context and for American audiences. And as much as I didn't agree that that would always be the case, I was trying to stay marketable and relevant. And and so, as you mentioned, right after I was kind of shifting what I did a little bit, not just into food, but into other, I was doing a bit of work on true crime and things like that. Then the pandemic hit and all of a sudden people thought I was marketable. So I've been, all these sort of feelers I was putting out into different areas that medical humanities can elucidate for us because it can elucidate so much nutrition and wellness and exercise culture, in addition to just covering things like illness itself. Then I've sort of had to do an about face and pick back up in my actual specialty.
Yeah, and I want to hear how you initially got interested in down this path, but maybe now is a good time to kind of define medical humanities because it was a new concept for me.
Yeah, and I find that it's not well understood broadly, although I hope that will be changing with the COVID pandemic. But medical humanities is one pragmatic way to think of it is an umbrella field under which we would find more recognizable things like medical ethics, bioethics, the history of medicine, things that are much more familiar to us. And medical humanities is all of those. Myself, I pull from a lot of different things. At some points, my work is very similar to medical anthropology. Sometimes, I've actually taught bioethics. I sit on several medical ethics panels locally, and I certainly am very historically based. But conceptually, the best way to define what, as you could imagine, is a very disparate field in some ways, the best way I can think to summarize what it always is doing is asking us to consider how we are framing and conceiving of the concepts that make up our science, medicine, and scientific medical research.
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times when people first hear what I do, and again, I think this is changing and growing, but people too readily think that perhaps we're debunking science.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in fact, we in the medical humanities field think of ourselves as very pro-science, but
Mm-hmm.
trying to help science learn where it might be biased unconsciously or not aware of certain things unconsciously or not factoring certain things in unconsciously.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to help science realize that in the present rather than, there's so many moments where we can look back and be like, oh my goodness, people really did think different races and different genders were differently evolved 150 years ago, something we now call scientific racism. We want to help scientists avoid that now instead of having to look back and realize we've gotten something egregiously wrong for hundreds of years.
Right. And it makes me think of, we talk a lot these days about the social determinants of health. And so it makes me think of that. And we're going to touch on some of that with this guest post that you did. And of course, possibly with the COVID conversation as well. But yeah, it seems like looking more closely at all of the factors that impact our health that at first glance you might not think are related.
I would amend that just slightly to say not just the factors that impact our health, but the factors that are impacting the way our research defines what affects what our health is. So I almost see us as sort of a meta-analytic, talking to the experts and saying, and there's so many examples throughout history. For instance, it took us a long time to realize that our traditional IQ testing methods were disproportionately disadvantaging children of color.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a long time for researchers to realize that they were asking questions that had much more to do with cultural knowledge and intelligences. I won't even say intelligence, cultural exposures, such as asking children to name a saucer by showing them a picture of a saucer. Mm-hmm. And it took people a while to realize that only certain economic classes are going to have unnecessary pieces of porcelain in their homes. That's not a measure of IQ. That's a measure of class.
Right.
And again, we're trying to be at the forefront of that so we can help people realize as they're developing their research, hey, this might not be measuring what you think it's measuring. And here's where we can pull from history and philosophy and science to say maybe there's a bias here or something we've overlooked that needs to be added to this equation.
Very interesting.
And this actually might circle back really well to how I got into this field, if you think that's okay to cover.
Yeah.
So I started out as a statistician, and more often than not always, but more often than not, I find that the medical humanists I know very well did start in some form of science or science adjacent field, which is, I think, important to note because, again, it's not people that are saying, well, let's look at poetry to understand this. So we might sometimes, we might, but that's certainly not, it's not just poets that decided they want to have a say in science. It's often people that really were well trained in science first and then felt there was something more to add to the equation than data. In fact, that would be the Cliff Notes version to my story. I say statistician, but I was a psychology major and I was oddly just wild about statistics as a young undergrad. Whenever I tell this story to my students, I always say, which is just, one of many proofs that I was a very normal child with a robust social life. I just loved statistics, loved it. Just absolutely hand calculating ANOVA calculations. I loved it. I was a tutor for doing it in my undergrad. I went to a clinical psychology program. And it may not be common knowledge that clinical psych PhD programs are not only, they're very competitive. It's the most difficult grad program type to get into in America, or at least it was at the time I entered. And it's not generally something that people who just want to be therapists go into. They certainly do matriculate therapists, but a lot of research psychologists are what we call clinical psychologists. So I went into a program where I was in a personality psychometrics lab. And that means a lab that I wanted to be a test maker. I used to say that my dream job was to work for eHarmony. And I was serious. That's all I wanted to do.
Which, side note, that's how I met my husband.
Oh my God. I wish I could say that I had helped you. I did not. I abandoned the field. But they hire psychometricians. And so psychometrics is basically any sort of cognitive or personality test measure. So IQ tests, certainly. But as I said, I was in a personality lab. So, I mean, the popular versions of this would be like the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs, although
Okay.
in the same breath, I have to say that none of those are statistically valid or reliable because the psychometrician still lives deep in my heart somewhere. And so I was very devoted to creating measures of understanding the human person through statistics. And I truly used to say, I mean, this is not a lie, not an exaggeration. I used to really believe that we could create a utopia through really perfected measures of personality testing. That we could figure out what society needed and we could just develop a perfect paradise on Earth. I look back now and I think I think I have a lot of 22-year-old students now that are a lot more mature than I was. This was a very simplistic understanding of data, of course. I say that now, 15 years later. But when I got into this program and we moved up there, they pretty quickly, as responsible statistical professors would do, divested me of that belief. And very quickly made us to learn that life is more than actuarial tables. And data about human subjects is just something that we then have to convert back into language and explanation, narrative, if you will, to make sense of. So it's like almost like a sausage maker or a pipeline where you take this information, this confusing data about humans, you filter it through a quantitative means, and then we have to translate it back into language and interpretation to make any sense of it. We're never going to get a pure understanding of just numeric data as truth with a capital T. And in learning this, they also taught us that, of course, statistics are only as good as their human implementers. And as the study design, I was also really well versed in study design at the time. And I mean, this seems like nothing. This is probably basic. People listening to this are like, sure. I cried for 3 days, Melissa. My vision of how we could solve every problem in the whole universe that I, however naively held on to was sincerely held by me. I cried for 3 days because I didn't know how else to find truth in the universe. And, I think a more mature version of me probably would have stayed with statistics and psychology. But at that time, I felt so betrayed by the thing that I thought would help me understand and make sense of a chaotic universe that I left completely. And I was like, it's not going to be quantitative data for me. I happened to go into English, to be honest, just because I had the undergraduate credits in it. But from the very beginning, I wanted to understand how other people had gone through these crises of faith with data. And what I could learn from that, if only to feel that I wasn't alone. And really what I tell my students today is that the Victorians, 1850s to about 1900, they're developing the baby steps of everything we know in modern science. I mean, the Petri dish was invented by a Victorian. The Golgi body that we know in the cell, Golgi was a Victorian. Let's see, Cook's principles of inoculating a bacteria in Petri dishes, that was a Victorian concept. The second law of thermodynamics, the idea of evolution, the idea of the inevitable heat death of the universe, the fact that the universe is always expanding. These were all Victorian concepts. And they went through a period as a culture of believing that science would have all the answers, particularly as they were having a secularization and a move away from religion. They turned to science, much like I saw myself doing. And they too eventually saw that data can't have all the answers, that there are these human factors, as you say, of wellness, health, illness, disease. And so that's kind of where I landed. And I said, I want to explore that further and further. I learned then of the medical humanities lens that helps us as sort of a tool in our toolkit to apply and understand and draw conclusions from these studies.
Wow. Very interesting. Oh, quite a journey.
That was a lot. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. I'm really glad you shared that. It does help, I think, give some context to what we're going to talk about today. And as I mentioned, I first learned about you through this guest post that you did on SciMoms. So I want to talk about that a little bit and want to explain SciMoms is a group whose goal is to advocate for science and evidence-based parenting. And I had one of the co-founders, Coven Synopathy, on the podcast back episode 119. We talked about food, pseudoscience, and science moms.
Oh.
And so been following them for quite some time. Actually, I had known about Coven for years before I had her on the show. And this one particular post really caught my attention. And so I started following you on Twitter. And the name of the post, the title that you wrote, was What the History of Quote Unquote Healthy Food Teaches Us About Mom Shaming. And you have a quote in the article that says, since everything we do with our kids is a choice at some level, we can't help but judge someone who appears to be choosing something different. And there's an article that you refer to in the post that you wrote that I want to tell everybody about. It's an open access article, so I'll have the link in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. It's an article that was published in the journal Sociological Science, and the title of it is A Taste of Inequality, Food's Symbolic Value Across the Socioeconomic Spectrum. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit as well. Let's share with the listeners a little bit about that post. And of course, I'll link to the post in my show notes as well. But I'd like to kind of start with how food has been tied to social status throughout history. You know, body fat used to be a status symbol. Now thin is in, so thin must be healthy. And how food insecurity and obesity are connected. So can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, it's hard to explain exactly how I came up with this idea, but I've thought it for years that I suppose it's just what I know about the Victorian era itself. And the Victorians were nothing if not egregiously offensively honest about what they thought was attractive and not. And so, for instance, you often see, and I am going to get to the food, but the thing that always is kind of more prominent is skin tone. And I mean, I'm going to set aside for the moment. No, I'm not. You can't set it aside. There are obvious racialized tones to that, for sure. But another aspect of why Victorians really valued pale skin is that meant that you had enough money to stay inside.
Mm-hmm.
And while there are very obvious, unavoidable, as I say, racialized tones to this valuing of light skin, in novels you read, they will most often refer it to class in these moments. So their, at least conscious reflections in those moments tended to be about working class versus non-working class. They would say things like, oh, she had pale skin like a lady, or her hands were rough and dark, showing she had worked in the fields. So that's more where they take it. And I guess it just always struck me, you know, with my 2020 or 2015 at the time brain, that we don't value that anymore. People make fun of they're self-deprecating about what they call pasty white skin, and tanning is in. And it just seemed to me that the parallel is that not just me, people who have to sit in cubicles from 9 to 5 to make ends meet don't often have time or money to go to the tanning salon or lay on a beach, which I think the tanning salon is emulating, after work. So it struck me that what was leisurely or representative of leisure, aka pale skin, 150 years ago, now the opposite is true, that having tanned skin indicates leisure and time to be outdoors and not trapped in front of computer screens. And so I kind of am always looking for what the common denominator is, you know, because the values shift over time. I see that. What can I say is the commonality? And to me, that will often give me my sort of medical humanities informed access to biases we may have and social determinants of health we may be missing. And so for me, my conclusion there was, it's whatever people have money to do, whatever is indicative of you have more money and time than most people, that's what's going to be fashionable, not the other way around. It's reversing the cause and effect, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so how can we apply that to food? Because we know from certainly periods before mine. I think by the Victorian era, we do see the wasp waist coming back into fashion through corsets. But we know from like the Renaissance that having a greater weight was associated with greater class because food insecurity was so rampant. And now, of course, it's impossible to not notice that our Western culture valorizes being very, very low weight. So again, what is the common denominator? I would say that, again, people with more wealth are somehow able to access different foods. And that led me to say, well, why? How? And to explore the ways that processed, unhealthy food has become cheaply accessible to the majority of our population. And so I don't know if you can tell or if I'm describing it well, but I have sort of a backwards approach, you know? Can we say that the cause and effect are aligned in the order we're thinking? What happens if we reverse it? What data would come up that way? And so that's how I got to a point where I was thinking, you know, I think the access to food, when we talk about food insecurity, may not always be a pure scarcity issue, but a quality and type issue as well. That is not to say that there isn't true food scarcity in America, of course.
Right. One of the things that you say in the article is because our economic status dictates our food and health choices, which perhaps aren't choices at all, nutrition and health are often more of a privilege than a choice. And that's why we shouldn't be so quick to start mom shaming or food shaming a parent for maybe giving their kid sugar. And that's kind of a segue into one of the points that I found really interesting in your article. So I'd like to share this with the listeners and talk about this a little bit before we move on to more of the pandemic stuff. In the study that you cite in the article, found that families in lower income brackets use food to buffer against deprivation, whereas higher income parents provision food to fulfill classed values around health and parenting. Then the research showing that parents who financially struggle tend to substitute easily affordable candy and sweets when they can't afford longer-term goods and services such as ballet or baseball lessons. So can we talk about that a little bit with regard to another aspect of food insecurity and not just obesity, but nutrition status?
Yeah, I think I want to start with what you said about, or you quoted me saying, you know, what may not end up being a choice at all. And I think for me, that's one of the most insidious things that I see in various aspects of American life and probably Western life. But I try to, you know, stick to America because it's where I'm from and what I know the best. And this may come up again with when we talk about the pandemic, but I think our society is structured in a really frustrating way often in which things look like choices or masquerade as choices, but which when we dig deeper, you know, perhaps there was a choice, but the choice was much narrower than it may appear at first blush. And that masquerading of choice is so dangerous because it allows other people to either just plain, you know, judge and mom shame a perceived choice another parent has made. But more importantly, I think for our purposes here, to misdirect where our research is going. Where we want to say, well, why won't they listen? You know, I hear this so often from my fellow pro-science people that I talk to. Why won't they listen to the data? The data, the data, the data. And my response is always, okay, again, what's the common denominator? If they're not listening to the data, it must not be about the data. It must be about something else. Or your data is asking the wrong questions. So why won't these parents, you know, give healthy options? What can we do to convince them or teach them about healthy options? Well, maybe it's not that they don't know. What research would we start doing if we stopped asking that research question?
Right.
For instance. And, you know, there's great research, for instance, on breastfeeding, infant breastfeeding. I don't have the study in front of me, but there's studies that say, you know, women aren't not breastfeeding because they don't, especially I think lower socioeconomic demographics. They've said, stop asking the question, why can't we teach them that breastfeeding is good? maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe we should ask what is hindering them.
What barriers and what thoughts?
Yes. And when the researchers asked that question, they realized that, somebody working at McDonald's, breastfeeding while on a shift at McDonald's is fundamentally going to look different than me sitting in my individual office as a professor where I have heating and cooling and my own space that nobody's allowed to come into.
It's clean.
And a flexible schedule. Yes. And so we not only do harm to these communities, but we as researchers, I see people so often so frustrated that why won't they listen to the data?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's because you've asked the wrong question
Mm-hmm.
and it's not allowing you to serve that community. So yes, asking why a community of people, why would a lollipop that they can get for 50 cents or 10 cents provide more for that family in the moment? Well, because they perhaps can't afford longer term goods.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been there, I'll say that my family has been on WIC before while we've had kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as a WIC recipient, I was required to go through a lot of paternalistic nutritional classes to get formula to feed my kids. And I have breastfed too under different circumstances when I had more time and money with my first daughter. So I've been in I don't know if I would say a class, because certainly I definitely always benefit from white privilege and things like that. But I have been in those moments where to give my kid a moment of happiness was something I could buy cheaply, made up for the fact that I couldn't afford to take her to mommy and me music classes at that point in my life.
Mm-hmm.
To me, and I think when we make it all about the nutrition, all about the science, we're ignoring those human factors that when we study scientifically, those human factors reveal vast wealths of information to us. The fact that food deserts have been studied in the last, decade or so has been really, I would say, eye-opening for nutritionist communities. You would probably be able to speak more to that than me, but I think it's changed how we approach a lot.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Imagine if we were doing that on many other fronts of how food, you mentioned the article about food's symbolic value. If we just keep pushing those boundaries of how we could frame the question differently, what might we be missing? I think we'll find more and more wealths of information that help us help one another as a community.
Yeah, I was on food stamps as a young child, and I often think maybe that's one of the reasons I became a dietitian. But as you're talking too, it makes me realize, I think maybe that's this aspect of looking beyond the data is one of the reasons that I love working with people with diabetes, because you have to look at the whole person and you have to look at the lifestyle and you have to look at the barriers. And there's so much fear and shame and stress involved. And that makes me think of how in my career span, I have seen the shift go from more of just straight on education to, motivational interviewing, where you're really asking more questions and open-ended questions and trying to get more information. So those are just some of the thoughts that came to me when you were talking.
I just love that so much, because in my most recent book, which is about COVID and like what past epidemics teach us, I keep saying this almost ad nauseum. We are not just biological organisms, There is so much more to what's motivating our food consumption and how we practice our relationship with food. So yeah, I just love that. I was looking some time ago at sort of Dave Ramsey-esque methods of, managing credit card payments and stuff. And I found an article I've never forgotten, because there's the typical sort of step-by-step, like this is what you do, and then this is what you do, and this is how you get out of debt in a week or whatever they say. Financial stuff is another thing I'll get on my high horse about, like, it's not so simple and we shouldn't be shaming people. Like poverty and poverty adjacent categories does different things to your mindset.
Yeah.
But I read this article that said, that's great. Like, it's great to have a purely mathematical approach, that doesn't factor in psychology into getting out of debt. But psychology is probably what got you into debt.
Mm.
And I just think that could be applied to so much, eating as well. Like, as you say, we are a whole person with psychosocial, emotional, and biological interactions with food. Mm-hmm. And the one element of that, fuels the others as well. I know that when I'm eating healthier, I crave healthier foods. And when I'm eating less healthy, I crave unhealthy foods. And that alone is a difficult cycle to break out of, not to mention if you have different traumas or class economic based experiences that interact with your relationship with food.
Right. And the values that we put on different types of foods and the whole like scarcity mindset, abundance versus scarcity, whether it's food or money, that could be applied in so many different settings or situations. And we do behave differently based on that mindset. So let's talk more about the pandemic and what it teaches us about ourselves and our communities. And, you know, I'm even just thinking as you were talking, clearly, I think mask wearing was a perfect example of sort of like this public health experiment and how it started and changed in the messaging and it was so many layers. And I saw an interesting article that talked about why, and of course, you know, I'm going to just speak for myself here, but we're not shaming anybody listening, and we're not going to, you know, hopefully fuel any fires or anything, but we just want to talk about this from a science and a humanistic standpoint. And like I said, I'm speaking for myself. Kari, you go ahead and, you know, you do you. But I saw this article that the title was something like Why Men Aren't Wearing Masks, or something about the various reasons why men are less likely to wear a mask or something like that. And it compared the public health campaign of mask wearing to condoms and AIDS back in the day. It made a really interesting point that it's not just about telling people that it works and that they should do it. It's making it comfortable. It's making it accessible. It's making it a desirable thing to do, you know? So
yes,
this kind of all fits together with what we've been talking about.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up masks. This reminds me of one of my favorite chapters in the book. Aside from the sort of broken record repetition in my book of we are not purely biological, which comes into play here in what I'm about to say, the other thing I say is I have just been sick by the way this has been politicized by both sides. Never in my book do I hide my political leanings. I'm pretty left. And yet I make a call throughout the book over and over that we have got to be able to talk to one another.
Yes.
I know, and I recognize even in the book, and I'll do it here, that calls for civility and politeness can also often be tone policing of marginalized groups. And that's not at all what I'm getting at. But I see a lot of people in my own demographic unable to respect one another. So I'm not addressing specific moments of tone policing, although I do acknowledge that that's a problem and we have to be careful about calls for civility that end up subjugating or silencing certain voices. But I've seen this, you know, among middle-class white people a lot, you know, just shaming one another. And here's what I have to say. Like, I see it so much from the pro-science camp, and it just drives me bonkers that they're just like, masks work. Here's the data. You're an idiot.
Anything ending, yeah, you're an idiot. Great. That's not helpful.
Thank you. And I straight out say in my book, I say, when have you ever been able to teach a group of students while beginning from the perspective that you think they're all idiots and you hate them? So maybe that's why your data isn't working.
Just a thought.
You know, it's like, again, I'm not against the data, but you're so angry that your data isn't working. And again, I'm talking to my fellow political party here. Yes, I think people should wear masks. I'm not anti-mask, but I just think you're confounding your own efforts by approaching it this way. And as you say, I mean, yeah, it's not about purely listening to the data. It's about addressing the reasons these communities might be averse to that. And here's some. I mean, you're right. It's accessibility, it's comfort, it's so many things. But another thing is the very way we have trained ourselves as a society, particularly in the pro-science camp, over decades, to believe in science as an undifferentiated, omnipotent authority from on high. Instead of recognizing science as a group of humans working furiously at lab benches who get tired sometimes, who get hungry sometimes, and who are doing their best to make sense of messy data that changes as they accumulate it.
Yeah.
We have damned ourselves, if you want to know my unfiltered opinion, because since the Victorian era, we have treated science as this thing that is going to save us, and it can, but not when we treat it as science with a capital S, instead of looking at it as a bunch of different humans who could be prone to error, which is why we have peer review, and who are trying their best to help us make sense of inordinately messy data. That belief would help society on both sides of a partisan divide not want to throw science out because science about mask wearing and recommendations have changed, for instance. That's where I see this instant, like, well, science has changed, so I'm not going to wear a mask.
No.
That actually, in my opinion, is the fault of us pro-science people having over-valorized, misrepresented science with clickbait articles. You can probably hear my voice getting shrill. I'm like very passionate about this. As a science believer, I think we've done ourselves a disservice by representing science as something more clear-cut and black and white than it is.
I'm really glad you're mentioning that because I talk about this a lot on the podcast. And this is what I think us science people struggle with, is that we think people want the black and white. We know it's not. And when we try to communicate the grayness, people are like, well, then you don't know, you're not sure. And there's all this doubt. And I don't know if you see it that way. I hope that that's not the case. But I feel like that's one of the challenges, is that people can't seem to be comfortable or appreciate that uncertainty, which I understand. But that's, like you said, that's science. It evolves. There's nuances. There's confirmation bias. There's study design, methodology. Like you said, people get tired. People make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. There's, the peer review process. There's so many aspects. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're just so right. And I think that's where we get into science communication as a field.
Yes.
On my website, I call myself a science communicator. And a lot of people on podcasts have asked me why I say that, because they're used to science communicators being somebody who feeds that messy data in a palatable, clearly digestible way to the public. Whereas I consider what I do is helping experts learn how to do that better. So I work with a team of engineers out of Nebraska, University of Nebraska, trying to communicate better to the public about antibiotic resistance. And this is exactly the dilemma we've come about, is that people don't want the gray area. And yet the black and white is going to confound your own efforts in the end. So what do you do? What we found is, and I love this because I'm a lit professor by, my classical training. What science communication studies have found is you need narrative. You need narrative and metaphor and analogy so that you can communicate the gray zones in a clear, concise, almost black and white way, if that makes sense. So, for instance, with our antibiotic resistance team, we've tried to understand, think about ways we could communicate horizontal mutations and evolution of bacteria. And we thought maybe representing it like a beehive might kind of help, sort of representing bacterial colonies as superorganisms, the way a beehive is more than the sum of its parts. And that's a good example that I can think of that is both data-driven in its meta-analytic approach, but it is a clear-cut thing. We all know what a beehive is from very early toddlerdom. But a beehive is complex because it's an organism that is alive, and we can see that movement and that fluidity in our mind's eye when we hear it. So it's a black and white way of giving us a fluid concept that better encapsulates that gray zone. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So we have the science communicator aspect in common because I do media and communications trainings. And I talk about this from time to time on the podcast, but been dabbling in storytelling. I even attended a storytelling workshop training at the National Institutes of Health, which was really interesting. Yeah, we'll have to talk offline about that.
Yeah.
Learning how to do story circles with science writers, taught by Randy Olson. Do you know who he is?
No.
He is a former marine biologist turned Hollywood filmmaker. What he's trying to do is bring narrative to science. like people who are writing the science articles or the journal articles, technical writing. So it was really, really interesting. But in my communications trainings, I'm speaking to, my peers, dietitians, but also diabetes educators, home economists, people who are working with the public or in the media themselves, and trying to get these credible science people to be more clear, concise, and compelling by, like you said, I call them secret ingredients, like using analogies, using metaphors, adding some stories here and there. You really bring the facts to life, because facts alone are not enough to, change hearts and minds.
Thank you. That is could be like my slogan on my tombstone. Yes, exactly. And that doesn't mean you're denying the data. And in fact, what you've just said is data driven. We know that is borne out in the data.
Right.
And here's my favorite factoid lately. This is even more so when we are talking about a polarizing issue.
Yes.
So there were some good studies, and I might be able to email them to you for the show notes. I'm not going to remember the citations right away, but they studied, I think, vaccination and climate change as a concept.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I love to say this to my science friends that are just, going crazy saying, why doesn't the data matter to people? What they found is an inverse correlation between science literacy and a tendency to move farther into their pre-existing belief about an issue when we're dealing with a polarizing issue. So to put that in better context, if you already believe that climate change is not real, the more science literate you are, the more you will dig your heels into that belief when presented with data. And that is not what we would predict. We want to say if we would educate people, they'll believe. But actually, we have a fairly scientifically literate society. And the more scientifically literate they are, the more they are going to, I believe, now this isn't in the study, this is what I think, that they're more able to poke holes in the research methodology. And what the study does say is that we are social animals. So the more threatened they are, the more they're going to retreat to the safety of what is familiar, which is their social circle, which is probably promoting the belief they already have. And so the data bears this out, that it's not about the data. And if we keep arguing about the data, we're just circling around and around, and it's dizzying and we get nowhere. We have to talk human to human. And to be able to do that, we have to be able to find some common ground, some ability to come to the table, for instance, and understand why somebody might not be wearing a mask, which means that we have to start asking different questions about mask wearing, for instance.
Absolutely. People will seek data and information to support their position. And one of the most compelling things for people is when they hear of or see somebody who maybe was in agreement with them, but changed to the other side. And so that more that human aspect of the story. So from your vantage point, what stands out to you the most about the pandemic and what we're seeing, what we're learning about ourselves and our communities?
Well, one thing that I've talked about since my research on the development of germ theory in the 1880s, which is the development of sort of the broad idea that many, many human diseases are contagious illnesses. What came out of this time is an awareness that we're very, very connected to one another, whether we want to think so or not. And in the 1880s, they were realizing this to be literally physically true. I mean, when you have a fecal oral disease like cholera, you're literally eating somebody's fecal matter, and that's how you got sick. And they were realizing that, we are connected in ways that repulse us to everyone and anyone around us. And that's probably, comes to the forefront of our minds, particularly when our connection is revealed to whom we would least like to see it, right? To groups that we already want to see as different or other. And so I've seen that coming up here. I mean, to go back to what we're talking about, like, your fate is connected to the anti-masker. And while I see that making people angry, they do recognize it. Your anger is just going to drive us farther apart and make us connected in our downfall. And if what it takes is for us to, I don't want to say be the bigger person, but
connect and come together?
Yeah, it may take you laying aside your frustrations and being willing to say, we are connected. And yes, if you don't wear a mask, I'm in trouble. So maybe I have to get over just being angry and shaming about it and find a way to connect with you.
Yeah.
And I see the same resistances to that concept, on both sides of the divide.
Mm-hmm.
What I see as well with masks, and I think this speaks to our present political moment, is also a denial of shared realities. Because we want to just deny data and fling data back and forth at one another and say that somebody else's data is false data. And I'll say, like I say it in my book, I've said it on other podcasts, I don't fully know the way around that. That is perhaps the most concerning thing to me, that if we just say that somebody's reality, somebody's news, somebody's data is completely incredible at its base, and that we can't believe anything the other person says because we believe it is politically motivated from the outset. I don't fully know how we get around that. All I know from my perspective is to highlight that as the root of the problem in our communications, and maybe hope that somebody can pick up from there and maybe do some research on where we could go, how we could connect from there. I find it very distressing that we can't believe the media anymore. And that goes for both sides. I mean, I distrust data I hear coming from people who I know I already disagree with. Like, how do we come back from that as a society? Because I think a lot of this with masks, for instance, is agreeing with, well, let me put a pin in that. And I'm going to start a completely new sentence that clarifies this.
Mm-hmm.
Public health crisis ethics are always about prioritizing a collective good over individual liberties in the time of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
This is already a difficult concept in America, where we are highly individualistic.
Mm-hmm.
All of us, I am not accepted from that. But when we're talking about something like COVID, that is pretty much a healthy carrier situation. I don't know that, scientists are using that exact term. It may not be the right technical term, but we all know that you may be spreading that disease unawares.
Mm-hmm.
We're not only asking a really individualistic culture to substitute the collective rights for their individual rights. We're also saying, let a collective understanding of reality be substituted for your individual understanding of your body.
Wow. Yeah, that's huge.
That's hard for any of us. I defy any of us, and I'll be the vulnerable one to say it. All of us have gone out because we felt okay at some point.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some extremists among us that have been more disciplined, but we have all been like, well, I feel okay. What reality do we have? This goes back to Descartes. If we can't trust the evidence of our own senses,
Yeah.
We literally often label that schizophrenia. That is all we have.
That's kind of how I feel.
Yes. And so I think we have to be more understanding as we encourage mask wearing.
Mm-hmm.
When people don't want to recognize that we're asking them to say, believe me when I'm telling you your own senses are wrong, of course there's going to be pushback from that.
Wow.
And shaming them and throwing data about masking is not the answer there. It's not even the dilemma we're dealing with,
Yeah, that makes me think of several family conferences we had at our home this summer, because on any given day, I was in a different place mentally, emotionally, learning new information, processing that information. And all I could think to do with my family, so my daughter was home from college and my son, he's in grade school or middle school, and my husband here, the only thing I could think to do was to have us sit down and talk through things, because I'm a very process-oriented person. So, that is my comfort zone. I'm not about absolutes. I get the uncertainties, but with this, there were so many uncertainties and so many things to think about. It was just overwhelming. So we had several family conferences, and at some points my kids were like, well, I'm confused. Is it this or that? And you changed your mind or whatever. That's why we're talking this through, so that we can just understand how everybody's feeling. Where are you at with this? What are you thinking? Can we sort of try to be on the same page? Because we all live in the same house, and my mom's immunocompromised. So I was kind of setting the bar a little high. Like, I'd like to see my mom, but what everybody is doing in this house can impact whether I can do that or not, It's a lot.
Yeah, this is hard for everyone. And I think I've been concerned by, for instance, like people of my own persuasion not admitting that this is hard, saying that it's just simple to wear a mask, saying that it's simple to recognize that you could just be sick. But I don't think that is simple. I mean, I'm sure listeners could hear it in my voice that when I talk about, if you really get into a position where you can't trust the evidence of your own senses, like that is literally all we have as humans, as organisms.
Yeah.
And it is hard. And I think it's disingenuous to not acknowledge that that is hard for everyone. And it's going to take some hard discussions.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that people may not have realized prior to this how much we do rely on our own sense of self. I think it's just such a part of who we are that we may not have kind of put our finger on it, but now it's very unsettling. And I think a lot of the anger too, this is not me as a dietitian talking, but I think a lot of the anger that we're seeing is coming from a place of fear.
Yeah. And I get that. I mean, we also think of disease as something that would be obvious to us. Healthy carrier situations are really tricky. So it's tough that this has piled on to the difficulties we face as we navigate a global crisis.
You know, I don't want to give too much away from your book. We are going to obviously have links to where people can find out more information about your book and how to get the book once it comes out. And of course, the other book is not really for the general public, your first book.
You know, people might want to read it. I'm told I have an accessible style as an academic, but it's much more niche. I would recommend checking out the Quarantine Life book. And then if you just can't get enough, then diving in for a deeper dive with my academic book, Kept from All Contagion.
But we have to wait until June 2021.
You can pre-order it now.
You can pre-order it now. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to read a little bit about the book. And then, like I said, I don't want to give too much away. And I know even if we talked for 3 hours, it would probably just scratch the surface of your research in the book. But I want to hear, based on previous epidemics or pandemics, what you think we might learn or where we might be headed with COVID, hopefully in a positive way. But let me just read a little bit about the book. Throughout history, there have been numerous epidemics that have threatened mankind with destruction. Diseases have the ability to highlight our shared concerns across the ages, affecting every social divide from national boundaries, economic categories, racial divisions, and beyond. Quarantine Life from Cholera to COVID-19 demonstrates that these conversations have always involved the same questions of individual liberties versus the common good, as you mentioned, debates about rushing new and untested treatments, considerations of whether quarantines are effective to begin with, and what to do about healthy carriers and how to keep trade circulating when society shuts down. So obviously very pertinent in these times, and we anxiously await. I'm going to do my pre-order when I get done talking with you. But so based on past epidemics, pandemics, what do you think we are learning or heading towards?
Well, yeah, I don't want to give away my conclusion where I summarize the 3 things that I think will get us through this. I think I probably shouldn't summarize that. I would say the 2 biggest points I make throughout the book are that we are not fully biological. And therefore, as you say, like it's going to take more than data about biology to change hearts and minds. And we've got to come together and change hearts and minds because our divisions are a virus's strength.
Amen. Yeah. I mean, all I keep thinking is, we have to be united. We have to come together. We have to work together. So thank you.
Yeah.
I'll have the link for people can pre-order the book. People can follow you on Twitter at @HalfSickShadows, which I just have to ask, where did that Twitter handle come from?
Oh, actually, they can learn in the conclusion of the book.
Oh, okay. Another teaser.
It's from a Tennyson poem. And I feel like I can't give it away, but it was originally going to be the title of my dissertation. Instead of Kept from All Contagion, it was going to be Half Sick Shadows. Yeah.
Right. And your website is mknixon.com. But again, I'll have the links and everything in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. Dr. Nixon, is there anything else you wanted to share with us today as we're wrapping up?
Oh, just a thank you for such a great conversation today, Melissa.
Well, I'm just so happy that I found you through SciMoms and through Twitter. I always say it's one of my favorite places to meet people. And I look forward to staying in touch with you and following your work. And thank you for enlightening me and our listeners on the medical humanities.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.